So let's say you are Vice President of the United States. You're facing your first midterm elections after you were elected, and so you know your party is going to lose seats. Beyond that historical inevitability, though, this is also turning out to be a year in which the opposition party's base is really enthused. For the first time since the 1930s, more Republicans are turning out to vote in Republican primaries than Democrats are turning out in Democratic primaries. For the first time since the 30s. That said, overall, big picture, no one's really turning out to vote. Republicans are turning out more people than Democrats are turning out, but both parties are down. And if you are a Democrat, there's your, relatively speaking, silver lining. Statistically speaking, the conservative movement this year has greatly enthused a very small number of people. So if you Democrats can get their turnout and enthusiasm numbers up, they can not only compete, Democrats could even potentially still win. On paper, it works perfectly. But in real life, if you're Vice President of the United States and a Democrat, how do you actually get your voters to turn out? How do you get Democratic voters to care about these elections? Here's how Vice President Joe Biden sees it. At a fundraiser this week, you said this is not your father's Republican Party. You've used the construction, the Republican Tea Party, as if those two things are merged. In terms of defining that alternative, in terms of sharpening the differences between the parties, making this not a referendum just on state of the country, but a choice, as you say. Should the Democrats welcome a chance to really engage on big questions of what government is for when we've got so many people dependent on unemployment, so many people dependent on food stamps, all these safety net things that people need because of the bad economy right now? And on the right, it's a wholesale assault on the very idea of a safety net, including wanting to get rid of Social Security and Medicare.
Yes. And as you've even said on your show, that Biden seems to be swinging a lot out there. Now, I'm ready for this fight. And what I do when I go into these districts where these congressmen, Republican congressmen, vote against this health care, I say, look, the choice is clear. I want Republican so-and-so, Congressman so-and-so, explain to the people in his district who lost their job through no fault of their own, because of the financial chicanery of Wall Street, because of this Ponzi scheme they had masquerading as a policy. Tell them why they should not get unemployment insurance. Every district go in, they say, oh, no, we're not against unemployment insurance. We're not against it. We're not against making sure that there's COBRA, that they have health care. We're not against it. When you press them, they're not against it. That's why this fight, I think the probably marquee fight is going to be on taxes. Think about this. Here you have Mitch McConnell offering talking about the deficit, offering a tax bill that the Washington Post said today, if it were to be passed, tax cuts for the very wealthy and corporate, if it were to be passed, would create a hole in the deficit bigger than the Recovery Act and the health care bill combined. Let me put this in perspective. We want a middle-class tax cut. If you're making $50,000 a year and you're a family of four, you get $2,100. That's the difference between being able to have meat a couple times a week, being able to pay your utility bill, making sure you can keep your kid in the community. $2,100 matters. You know where 50% of the tax cut for the top bracket go, and that's $350 billion? To people whose average income is $8.3 million a year. And they're going to get a $350,000 tax break. What are they going to do with that they couldn't do already? But yet somebody, a family of four, making $100,000. They have two kids in school. They get a $4,100 tax break. It matters to them. It matters. I want this fight. I want this fight.
Does that mean that letting the Bush tax cuts expire for the richest people in the country while pushing for their extension and middle-class tax cut for everybody else, is that a black and white issue? Is that we haven't heard a veto threat, for example, from the president on that.
It is a black and white.
It's a black and white issue. That's something that the administration is going to go to the mat for.
Yes, absolutely. And look, here's the deal. The deal is that if you think about it in sort of black and white terms, it also points out the hypocrisy of the Republicans talking about deficits. Remember, these are the guys that put two wars and a prescription drug bill and a credit card plus a tax cut. The day we walked into office, we inherited a deficit of $1.3 trillion. Before we turned the lights on in the West Wing, we had, in the previous 7 months, lost 3,750,000 jobs. And folks, you know, what we got to make clear to people is these guys are straightforward. They're not bad. These opposition, they're not bad guys. But they really believe what the leader of the Republican campaign committee said. We are going to reinstate the exact same agenda. Look, this would be a different fight if they said, you know, the Bush policies really dropped us in a hole so deep that it's just this short of a depression. And you know, we don't like the Democrat answers, but we offering these answers that are different. They're not. They're saying we don't like the Democrat. I know what they're against. I don't know what they're for yet. That's at all different. I mean this literally. What are they for that's different than they have been for the previous 8 years?
If I was running against Democrats right now, if I was running as a Republican politician, I would do everything that I could to avoid saying what I was for.
Exactly right.
Because what you want people is to do is focus on what they're dissatisfied with and put all that on the Democrats. So it comes down to sharp Democrat strategy. Democratic strategy comes down to sharpening the focus on who the Republicans are.
Exactly right.
Seems to me like the most interesting thing about Republicans right now is that it is impossible to be a moderate and to sustain re-election. So you had a lot of allies in the Senate across the aisle, people like Dick Lugar and Chuck Hagel. Did those bipartisan relationships, when there were some either moderates or at least people who were friendly across the aisle, did those have an actual benefit to the country, or did that just make it nicer to be a senator? Did it just improve your working environment? Because those things are never going to happen again.
Well, I hope I'm afraid they're not going to happen soon, but I hope we're wrong about they're not going to happen again. I think they did have a great deal of benefit to the country in substantive ways. You know, in terms of our willingness for all the stuff that Bush did, there was still the willingness of the folks you named to try to cut a different path in American foreign policy, to try to cut a different path on social issues, to try to cut a different path on the extreme positions that are being were being pushed even then. But now they've sort of doubled down. With this moderates gone, it's enabled them to double down. I mean, look at that Forbes magazine article about the president. If you read it, the article reads like science fiction. That here, you know, Barack Obama is the Kenyan anti-colonialist, a father who was a drunkard, is now reincarnated, I forget the exact phrase, in the White House. It's all being channeled through. And guys like Newt Gingrich repeating that garbage? I mean, this is kind of what's happened on the Republican side. I mean, it's gotten to the point where, you know, it's the same old playbook. When you can't compete in ideas, what you do is the same playbook out of conservative playbook. You try to delegitimize the other guy. That's what's going on. The attempt to delegitimize one of the most talented men to enter American politics in 3 generations. They did the same thing with Bill Clinton. Remember, Bill Clinton was part of a drug network in drug dealers in Arkansas. Bill Clinton was somehow complicitous in the murder of an individual. I mean, they you know, when you looked at this at these guys, I mean, it was all about delegitimizing. And one of the
it worked. It did weaken the Clinton presidency.
Well, it did, but it didn't work. It ultimately didn't work. He was elected 2 terms, and during his term, we created millions of jobs. Middle-class folks actually saw their incomes go up. You really saw a change in our foreign policy. We were respected. I mean, so it didn't work, and it's not going to work this time. But it will work if we're silent. It will work if we're silent. And I know I sometimes get criticized for going out and punching back. Well, let me tell you something. I learned a long time ago. You cannot underestimate these guys. You cannot sit back and just take the punch.
When the punch is insane, when the punch is the president is secretly foreign, or the president is secretly a space alien, or whatever the flavor of the week is in there, what's the best way to punch back? In in storytelling, in making effective, memorable news stories about this sort of thing, usually the most fun thing to do is to talk about the person who has come up with that science fiction, sort of name and shame them, try to make them famous for it. That's not the way it works in politics, because to do that, you guys would have to be elevating these sort of smear merchants who are coming up with these things. So how do you respond when the question's about the birth certificate or anything else like that?
Well, the way you respond is go and try to focus on the ideas, substantive ideas, the smear merchants are peddling, to point out that this isn't about the accusation they're making. It's about delegitimization, to try to give an opportunity for their argument to win without having to make it. And so it seems to me it's a little bit like, again, I've known Newt Gingrich for years. I am stunned. I really am. I am stunned he bought into this playbook. I mean, there is seems like such a desperation on the Republican side to pander to the lowest common denominator that it is. And by the way, my wife always says, I say, look, I have great faith in the American people's judgment, and she'd look at me and say, you know, would you have as much faith had you lost? But the truth of the matter is I do. The American people will see through this, but what they want to know from us, is we want to fight to keep going. We want to fight for our agenda. We care enough about this to fight back. And the best way to fight back is with the facts. It's that old cliche. Harry Truman said, you know, they yelled, give them hell, Harry, and he yelled back, I'm not giving hell, I'm just going to tell them the truth. They're going to think it's hell.
For the record, I don't think that any Republican candidate, say for Senate or governor this year, has yet accused Barack Obama of being from space. But now we know what the administration's response will be when that inevitably comes up. More from my interview with Joe Biden, including some news from him about the don't ask, don't tell policy, plus some late-breaking election results from last night's primaries, some very important Lady Gaga news, all coming up. Please stay with us.